Nagi's elimination and separation from Reo is easily among the most emotionally devastating moments in all of Blue Lock. But within Reo's tearful farewell, there was one moment that really jumped out to me. It's that Reo apologizes for forcing Nagi to play football and even releases him from this burden, as if the present day Nagi had still been playing against his will. We see the exact same thing on display right after the Manshine match as well. In Reo's mind, Nagi is still the exact same old slob who can only be motivated by dangling the carrot of idleness in front of him, even though Nagi at this stage is fully transparent about how Reo changed his entire outlook on life. So here's the tragic reality of the situation. Despite being the closest friend Nagi has ever had, despite witnessing Nagi's transformation firsthand, Reo seems oblivious to how Nagi has grown and changed as a person. Until the bitter end, Reo treats Nagi as a caricature of his past self and completely fails to understand his true needs. And in the aftermath of their disastrous reunion, Nagi ends up isolated, empty, and miserable. So here's the question that's just been gnawing at me ever since this chapter dropped. If even the person who is positively obsessed about being at Nagi's side ultimately fails to truly understand Nagi, is there any hope at all for the inhabitants of the Blue Lock universe to see into the hearts of others? Or to put it differently, in a story where success and fulfillment are inseparably linked to obeying one's own selfish desires, is it even possible to form real and meaningful connections with another person? Hello, my name is Sean, and I've been intending on making a video on the Nagi-Reo dynamic for ages now. And then Nagi got eliminated, and I had to put all my prior assumptions into the shredder. So here I am, picking up the shattered pieces. And if you want to help soften the blow a bit, or just help support the channel, do consider supporting me on Patreon. You'll get access to my podcast where I discuss the new Blue Lock chapters every week, and also help me cover channel-related expenses. I've talked in the past about how I find it really interesting that Blue Lock is a story about indulging in unabashed egotism, yet also constantly shows characters with a deep craving for interpersonal relationships. From Kaiser's deep-seated yearning to be loved, to Bachira's struggles with social isolation, and Rin's desire to be acknowledged by the brother he idolizes. I've even made a whole video on Nagi's search for connections, which is in all honesty a bit of a mixed bag in terms of how well it aged. So in this video, I want to take the next step. If Blue Lock consistently highlights the human desire for meaningful connections, what does it actually have to say about whether such connections can actually exist? And while the Nagi-Reo dynamic will be a major focus of this analysis, for reasons that I assume are quite obvious, is not really a video on Nagi and Reo in isolation. What I'm rather interested in is why a story like Blue Lock would place so much emphasis on their relationship and how it ties in with the manga's broader thematic messaging. But before I touch on Nagi and Reo, let me turn to another inseparable pair. Mick and Snuffy were two peas in a pod, a revolutionary duo united by a shared dream. Until they weren't. As it turns out, the latent differences between their mentalities couldn't have been starker. When they hit rock bottom, one elects to take a realistic approach, to grow up, while the other refuses any compromise and remains a shitty brat. So here's the first takeaway of their storyline. Even the closest of friends could never be on the same wavelength to begin with. But more tragic still are the implications that there was a causal connection between their falling out and Mick's suicide. For one, chapter 229 has Mick ominously dispensing his last advice to his best friend only after Snuffy abandons their dream. Before their inevitable falling out, all signs point towards Mick being ready to give another shot. Moreover, on a symbolic level, the page of Snuffy walking out on Mick is directly followed by a page of him embracing the lifeless corpse of his best friend. And there is surely a point being made by this sudden temporal jump, right? For all intents and purposes, the direct cause of Mick's premature fate wasn't his waning star, but rather the experience of being betrayed by the one person who he thought would have his back. In the world of Blue Lock, those who lean on others get left to die all alone. So, on that happy note, let's turn to Nagi and Reo, because I don't think I need to belabor the parallels between their situations. Now let me start by stating something completely obvious, but it does need to be said. Their status as an explicit duo flies in the face of the Blue Lock program's very purpose, which is to create a singular world's greatest striker, a lone hero on a mountain of corpses. In fact, Ego confronts them with this paradox at the very start of the episode Nagi spin-off. They can't become the world's best together because there can only be one world's best. So when the manga makes the defining decision to cast two of its main characters as a duo and has some of their most important writing revolve around their relationship, it's very clearly trying to say something about the role of interpersonal relationships in a universe governed by ego. Yet, what makes the Nagi Reo dynamic so fascinating to me is the chemistry between the two partners. One of the foundational techniques of character writing is establishing a juxtaposition between what a character wants and what they actually need deep inside. A typical character arc therefore often revolves around them learning that their initial worldview and desires were misguided, and sees them gradually opening up to their true needs. So for example, Rin's initial want was to be together with and acknowledged by Sai, but what he actually needs is to step out of Sai's shadow and follow the impulses that truly set his soul ablaze. So here's what makes Nagi and Reo so compatible with each other. As is highlighted about them during their very introduction, the two of them have virtually identical character needs. Both have lived vapid lives filled with boredom. One because he wants nothing, and the other because he has everything. And over the course of the story, it becomes clear that Blue Lock offered them a kind of fulfillment unlike anything they'd ever experienced. They finally found themselves in an environment where they were challenged and fired up, an escape from the mundane reality that left them hollow and miserable. To put it differently, between the veneer of surface level differences, Nagi and Reo are uniquely well positioned to understand each other, because deep within, they yearn for the exact same thing. So narratively speaking, Nagi and Reo aren't a pair just because they happen to have played together before entering Blue Lock. Rather, the story positions the two as virtual soulmates. Also, because some obvious things need to be said out loud, the Suzel's channel officially endorses this ship. Yet, despite there being so much potential for Nagi and Reo to forge the most powerful relationship in the story, the narrative unfolds rather differently. And crucially, this is due to fatal flaws on both sides. Let me return to Reo's shortcomings first. Our chameleonaire's entire worldview was molded by his upbringing as the heir to a major keiretsu conglomerate. In the mindset of the 1%, the purpose of life is to own a ludicrous amount of stuff. And for this reason, Reo falsely believes that what he yearns for is to have something that no one else can. So when Reo encounters in Seishiro Nagi an untapped asset, a gold mine that everyone else has passed by, his immediate instinct is to claim him as his property. Nagi is not Reo's treasure because Reo actually treasures him as a person, but because he's a commodity over which the scion of the Mikage Corporation can assert exclusive ownership. This is also the lens through which Reo perceives Nagi's defection in the second selection. He has lost what is rightfully his, and that's a slight that must be repaid. And interestingly enough, Isagi's words at the end of the 3v3 fully intersect with his capitalist mindset. Reo must become someone who can seize whatever he desires. That's the privilege of being the top dog in the material world. Now, as we enter the third selection, Reo finally acknowledges that Nagi isn't his property anymore. However, that doesn't change the fact that Reo still wants to own Nagi. The only change is that he now believes that he needs to earn this trophy. And once Reo regains his lost treasure in the NEL, he furiously fends off any potential competitors. This time around, he won't make the same mistake. They'll need to pry his prized possession from his cold, dead hands. So, circling back to my observations at the start of the video about how Reo never actually understood Nagi's true desires, the explanation for this is rather simple. Our plutocrat was too busy LARPing capitalism to recognise a kindred spirit. And during their separation, in one of the most poignant moments in the entire series, Nagi exposes the sheer shallowness of Reo's mentality. All this time, the real treasure was the roommates they made along the way. And alright, I know I presented that as a bit of a joke, but Reo is really a tragic character, right? He comes from a family that taught him to value possessions over people, and as a result, he was content with just owning Nagi rather than trying to gain more than a surface level understanding of his partner's inner psyche. And so, he ultimately failed to realize Nagi's true needs and guide him accordingly. So now, let's move on to the other party, to Nagi's similar ignorance of Reo's needs. From the earliest parts of the story, Nagi has been shown to be oblivious about what might be going on in the minds of others. So, if Reo's shortcoming is that he doesn't scratch beneath the surface, Nagi doesn't bother to consider the needs of others at all. Now, that's not to say that Nagi made the incorrect decision to leave Reo behind in the second selection or anything, but it is a fact that he didn't bat an eye at plunging Reo into solitude. More egregious still, however, is their reunion in their match against Bastard München. Reo tries to establish boundaries with his ex and tells him that he doesn't want to relapse, only for Nagi to incessantly love-bomb him by appealing to Reo's worst instincts and saying the exact things that Reo yearns to hear. Intentional or not, if that's not emotional manipulation, I don't know what is. Moreover, Nagi's blatant disregard for Reo's emotional needs becomes even more charged within the context of the Mannschein match. I've talked about this in detail in some of my past videos, but the central theme of the Mannschein match is seeing the value of other people's perspectives. Isagi starts considering the fixations of others, and that's what allows him to set up the winning goal. Nagi ignores Reo's needs in favour of his own desires, and thereby inadvertently seals his own fate. The contrast couldn't be starker, right? Now, let's take a step back from all the intricacies of Nagi and Reo's characters and ask a more fundamental question. What's the thematic purpose of elevating their reunion and eventual separation into the B-plot of the entire NEL? Personally, I find codependency bad a deeply uninteresting takeaway of these events, if only because this point had already been hammered home in the second selection. On the other hand, if the purpose of the entire Nagi storyline is just to teach us that satisfaction causes one's talents to wither away, there would be no need to weave in the entire plot about Nagi getting together with Reo, right? Kaneshiro could have easily found a way to give Nagi his 5 feint volley shot without involving Reo at all. Rather, I believe that the Nagi-Reo dynamic plays such a prominent role in the story because Blue Lock is deeply interested in the intersection between interpersonal relationships, ego, and success. So let me turn to one of the most important points of comparison to Nagi and Reo in the NEL, the Isagi-Hiori dynamic in the Ubers match. Hiori's main character conflict in this part of the story revolves around how to enjoy playing football free from the toxic expectations of his parents. Due to these past experiences, he fears that playing with Isagi will again subordinate him to the suffocating desires of others. But as he comes to realize over the course of the match, these fears arose because he didn't fully understand the differences between his parents' and Isagi's expectations. In the egoist framework, you will never succeed by imposing expectations on another person or trying to live up to the expectations of others. Rather, healthy cooperation comes about from directing one's expectations at a tangible outcome that can be achieved together. Also, Quick aside, but it's quite telling in this light that Nagi during his match against Bachira tries to become the person Reo wants him to be. To conform to Reo's expectations, basically. The outcome speaks for itself. After all, Hiori already taught us that trying to do so is a recipe for disaster. Anyways, let's unpack the assumptions in the Hiori storyline. I've no problems to accept that this is a great approach to interpersonal relationships on what we might call a professional level, if you treat relationships as a means to attain success. However, the ending of the Ubers match, in my view, begs the question whether this is the only kind of relationship worth having. Let's turn back a moment. As Isagi advocates for subbing in Hiori, the two of them refer to each other as their buddy. This suggests that they're on a personal rather than a professional level. So then, right after their win and goal, Isagi again addresses Hiori as his buddy. He seems positively elated to have found a new bestie. Hiori, however, swiftly douses that hope. He's no longer interested in playing nice with Isagi and instead recasts their friendship into a purely transactional relationship. Awakening to his true ego means that he now only values relationships insofar as they help him fulfill his selfish desires, and that means keeping Isagi at a safe distance. It's hard to avoid the impression that Isagi and Hiori serve as a deliberate juxtaposition to Nagi and Reo. The former duo correctly establishes a temporary utilitarian situationship of sorts, where the latter makes a misguided attempt at winning through the power of friendship. These ideas are taken even further in a PXG match. In its finale, Isagi effectively posits that any kind of connection to another person is a detriment to success. He rightfully identifies Ness as an undervalued asset, whereas Kaiser let his personal sentiments towards Ness sway his judgment. I said this earlier in the video, but it's worth repeating in this context. Blue Lock is filled to the brim with characters craving human connections, and perhaps none more than Michael Kaiser. It therefore seems that Kaiser's fatal mistake says a lot about the story's messaging. At the very end, the one with the greatest need for love and affection in the series is effectively punished for being affected by the only friendship he ever established. We see the same lesson highlighted with the other major antagonist of the match as well. Rin's behaviour is strongly fueled by personal sentiments, and these tendencies get ruthlessly exploited by his German opponents. To put it simply, the PXG match goes beyond criticising codependency or unhealthy fixations. It's a match that puts Isagi's transformation into an emotionless machine on a pedestal, and when facing off against this hyper-rational mentality, any level of attachment to another person is a sign of weakness, a fatal flaw that will set you up for failure. And for Rin's character in particular, recent manga events show that he must also let go of his fixations on other people. He might have never become the striker he is today without Sai and Isagi, but these rivalries are nevertheless a necessary evil that must be eliminated for him to become his essential self. Long story short, the manga shows us time and again that aiming for success means choosing isolation, severing ties with those around you, and heeding nothing but your innermost desires. So, Blue Lock's message seems to be that you can never become the world's best striker if you aren't the world's loneliest person. And well, I don't want to place too much stock in this because it's kind of a speculative interpretation. I couldn't help but be reminded here of some comments I saw online about chapter 301. During the post-NEL victory parades, Isagi declares that he won't be satisfied until he's become the world's best with his back turned towards his best friend. By implication, aspiring to greatness means squarely facing the world without looking back to the people you care about. With all this established, I want to re-examine perhaps the most crucial scenes in the story when we're talking about loneliness. In the second selection, we discover that Meguru Bachira's greatest source of insecurity is that he'll never find another person who shares his passion, to the point that he's positively consumed by his loneliness. So as the 4v4 unfolds, he's forced to do some serious soul searching. He's at risk of falling behind those around him because he keeps searching for others rather than obeying his own ego. Again, the matter at hand goes beyond pure dependence on Isagi. The manga places Bachira on a crossroads between his desires for connection and high-level football, which he comes to see as mutually exclusive. And the wording matters here. To break his curse, he doesn't choose excellence or ego, but loneliness. Because as Bachira sees it, loneliness is the prerequisite to become his authentic self. Now, I probably don't have to tell you this, but Isagi ultimately denies Bachira's descent into isolation by forcefully entering his lonely world. Paradoxically, Bachira's last-ditch effort to free himself from his reliance on Isagi allowed him to reconnect with his best friend. The aftermath of this match explicitly casts this as the ideal form of friendship between egoists. To put it in my own words, egoists independently strive to be their best selves, which allows them to fruitfully engage with like-minded people and thereby raise each other to greater heights. You must fight alone so that you can have fun together. Yet, as I've returned to this scene after the ending of the NEL, I found myself wondering if this is really the blueprint to a true friendship. Like with the Hiori scene I discussed earlier, the scope of a Blue Lock style friendship is surprisingly limited. Blue Lock seems to believe that following your intrinsic desires is its own reward, with the resultant mutually rewarding interactions being nothing more than a cherry on top. And as soon as someone doesn't keep up with your own greatness, the correct course of action is to drop them like flies. After all, a friend who isn't of any use to you has all but lost their purpose. It's interesting to look at Isagi's final words to Nagi in that light as well. Don't stop playing football might be what Nagi needed to hear at this moment, but it's also maximally self-serving from Isagi's point of view. It's an affirmation that their relationship revolves around competition and that Isagi has benefited tremendously from their time together. In other words, I find it hard to shake the suspicion that the important reason why Isagi wants Nagi to keep playing football is because their rivalry has made him a better player. This becomes especially interesting when we look at Nagi's big loss in the NEL, which directly responds to Bachira's scene in the second selection. At the end of FC Barca vs Manshine City, Nagi comes to the same realization as Bachira did all that time ago, that he must learn to fight on his own. Yet, the moment he's forced into a corner, Nagi caves and relies on Reo once more. Bachira then intercepts the pass with clinical precision and swiftly eliminates him from Blue Lock, all the while recanting the truth that Nagi's inability to pull through alone makes him a failure of an egoist. I'm far from the first person to observe that we've gone full circle from the second selection here. Back then, Nagi was the one to chastise Bachira for trailing behind the match's main stars and confront him with the bitter reality that he wouldn't be chosen. But even more significantly, Bachira intercepting Nagi's pass in the NEL makes him the equivalent to Isagi blocking his shot back in the 4v4, up to striking similarities in composition between the two spreads. Moreover, Bachira critiques Nagi for not making the choice that he had made all that time ago, for not committing to the lonely brand of football that would free him from his curse. The results are obvious. Where Bachira's pursuit of loneliness had reunited him with Isagi, Nagi's reliance on his partner severed his bond with Reo for good, and with that, Nagi's left behind, all alone. In November 2023, the World Health Organization declared loneliness a global health concern. And if you think that's overblown, the science says otherwise. This June, the WHO published a comprehensive report on the topic. The report shows that approximately 16% of the global population reports feeling lonely, which is a serious cause for concern because research over the years has established various causal links between loneliness and both illness and mortality. For instance, it sets out that recent meta-analyses show that among mostly older adults, loneliness and social isolation increase the risk of all-cause mortality by 9 to 22% and 32 to 33% respectively. In simple terms, you're more likely to die prematurely if you're alone and isolated. Moreover, there's ample evidence to show that loneliness is associated with a higher risk of cardiovascular diseases and diabetes. And while there is less research on these issues, existing findings also suggest that isolation makes you less resistant to diseases in general and increases risks of poor physical health. And that's without even touching on the toll on your mental health of prolonged loneliness, which is of course tremendous. Overall, the WHO estimates that loneliness leads to 871,000 deaths per year. There's a lot of discourse at the moment about us living through an unprecedented era of loneliness due to the emergence of social media. I therefore want to share some findings from the report that run counter to a lot of common assumptions. The first thing that really struck me about this report was some of the findings about demographics. Based on data from across the entire world, the two main factors that prevent loneliness are age and income. The older and wealthier you get, the less lonely you become, statistically speaking of course. To grotesquely simplify the matter, as people age, they expand their social network, so they become more connected over the years. And with regards to income, greater financial security and resources offer you more avenues to participate in society. Interestingly enough, especially in light of an alleged male loneliness epidemic in recent times, the differences between genders aren't that pronounced in the grand scheme of things. Women are actually even slightly lonelier on average. There are, however, some remarkable gender discrepancies among certain age demographics. In particular, it's really concerning to me that globally almost 25% of teenage girls report feeling lonely, which is much higher than any other demographic in the report. Also, of particular relevance to a Blue Lock video, it turns out that people in collectivist cultures actually report higher levels of loneliness. As shown by a 2022 study by Manuela Barreto et al., this is exacerbated by the fact that people perceive greater shame and stigma for loneliness in collectivist cultures. The reason for this seems to be that notions of interdependence are so central to collectivist cultures that not fitting in and thereby deviating from the norm constitute a much greater social taboo than in more individualistic societies. In terms of internet and social media, the WHO seems to think it's a mixed bag. On the one hand, it expresses serious concerns about social media depriving especially young people of real connections. But at the same time, there's a real benefit in allowing people to stay in touch with their loved ones across vast distances. And this is a real boon to, for instance, migrants, who report much higher levels of isolation than their peers who are native, let's say. What interested me in all these findings is that they seem to run counter to common narratives about modern life. The idea that capitalism and individualism have eroded traditional communities, resulting in widespread social isolation and alienation. As it turns out, people in wealthy, urbanized and individualistic societies at least seem to be better off connected than their contemporary counterparts in other parts of the world. Now, the big caveat here is that long-term data on loneliness simply doesn't exist. As I mentioned before, 16% of the global population reports being lonely, but whether this is unusually high is anyone's guess. And people who are convinced one way or the other are basing their views on ideology rather than the hard data. So let's circle back to our edgy football comic. Blue Lock is of course just a story, and while the data suggests that loneliness is something that you can and should prevent, I'd be the last to denounce fiction for letting real-life statistics get in the way of a compelling narrative. More crucially to me, I find it really interesting how Blue Lock deliberately creates a tension of sorts between success and companionship. On the one hand, the story consistently tells us that you must embrace solitude to lead an authentic and fulfilling life. Yet, at the same time, we're shown countless examples of characters deeply craving and finding tremendous fulfillment in their relationships with others. When Seishiro Nagi gets eliminated, he spends his last moments telling everyone that he was truly happy in Blue Lock, that his messy, imperfect relationship with Reo shone light into his empty life. But in the world of Blue Lock, being content isn't enough to reach fulfillment, and striving to be with others will only lead you to your doom. The story of Nagi and Reo is about a couple that was meant to be in a world of enforced isolation. The aforementioned World Health Organization report shows unequivocal evidence that solitude is detrimental to both your physical and mental well-being. So what do they recommend to stave off this real threat to your health? The answer is honestly quite self-evident, and I quote here, frequent contact with friends and family, good relationships with them, and receiving and giving support are protective factors against loneliness. Our world is fortunately not like Blue Lock. Thank you all for watching. I also want to shout out the complete strangers who make up my €10 tier on Patreon. Alex McKay, Liam Dunseith, Mick J. Cave 18, Melody and Orangey Legend. Thanks so much for everything. And until next time, Slán go fóill.